So nice. Very good. Thank you so very much. All of you who are speaking are bringing back for us great encouragement, seeing where we are today and what you had to go through at that time to preach and reach out to people compared to the, the relative calm and opulence that we have today. And, it's just amazing. Thank you very much. Really appreciate everything you said.
One thing I will say is that the camaraderie that we all had was really something. Mm. We underwent a lot of, it's hard to even say sacrifice because it was spiritually, it was a sacrifice, but it was really so ecstatic to do what we were doing. It was very intense, but very blissful at the same time. And everybody sacrificed so much, but it wasn't all that hard, really. I mean, other than dealing with your own mind, but all the, the friendships and everything that everybody had and the close association that you had.
Yes.
You never had any experience like that outside of being a devotee.
Nice. Thank you, Guru. Thank you so very much. So His Grace Maheshwara Prabhu first began studying philosophy of Krishna consciousness in 1973. In October 1975, he joined the Radha Damodara traveling Sankirtan party after he dropped out from the University of Kansas. In March 1976, he was initiated by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. During his service as a devotee, he was involved in many ISKCON projects like temple construction, building Ratha Yatra carts, designing restaurants, planning and construction of Srila Prabhupada's Samadhi Mandir in Vrindavan, India, and also visualized the original Mayapur Lotus Fountain Garden. In 1981, he spent 5 years in Los Angeles assisting His Grace Amarendra Prabhu, as a paralegal for the BBT legal office. In 1984, he began Jagannath Enterprises and started a Namahatta Bhakti Vriksha preaching program. He engages in several public outreach events and preaching programs. Thank you so very much, Maheshwara Prabhu. Please enlighten us.
Thank you for this opportunity. Let me begin by saying Om Jnanatam Randasya Galanjana Salakaya Chakshruvan Militandhyena Tajma Shri Gurave Namaha Vanchakalpatru Vistra Kritasindhavyeva Chapatitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So actually Radha Damodara had a very monumental impact on my life, and to help other people really understand just how much of an impact it was, I have to spend a minute here just giving a little bit of background. I was raised Presbyterian in New York and went to school at the University of Kansas, and I was told that I was not going to be done with my education until I graduated. I was studying industrial design and was bored silly going to the they took us to field trips out to the Cessna Aircraft Company, which is in Wichita, and I saw my future and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do this. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, so I took off 2 years and I went to Europe, and I kind of knew that what I was looking for was something I had to resolve within myself, but I also knew that I had to find, I knew if I changed the environment, something might happen. So I dropped out of college after 2 years, went to Europe, and actually ran into the devotees in Paris, France, doing Sankirtan. And because we were just wandering around, I went with 2 high school buddies of mine, and they gave us one of these invitations to the temple, the feast, the Sunday feast. It was sort of my first introduction to what we would say is the maybe not so organized Hare Krishna movement, because they gave us this address and we went to the temple and it was raining a little bit and we really didn't have anything to do and we really wanted to go in, but there was no sign on the door and it was starting to get a little bit too wet and we were about ready to leave, and just as we left, the devotees drove up and said, oh yeah, you're at the right door. We were actually standing on the front steps of the temple in France and was just close away from walking away. So eventually we attended that program. There's all sorts of interesting stories there. And when we left, I had already read one version of the Bhagavad Gita in my personal growth, my own personal growth process. I was very disappointed with it, and mentioned that to the devotees as I was walking out. And they had told me at the time, the Macmillan BBT had Bhagavad Gita had just come out, and they made it clear to me. They said, "You read the wrong one." And somehow I heard that and I understood it, but I wasn't going to carry this huge, what looked to me like a brick in the back of my backpack. I mean, my spiritual book at the time was a little Gideon's Bible, which was about the size of a pack of cigarettes. And I was not going to take that book with me. So but I did promise I'd get it when I got home. And by strange mystical arrangements, a whole lot of side stories here I'm going to leave out, I did go back to school. My third year in the University of Kansas, picked it up. And because it was printed by Macmillan, it was actually in the University of Kansas school bookstore. And there was just one copy there. Now, this is actually pretty remarkable because there were no temples anywhere near Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas at the time. Now there's a temple in Kansas City, but at the time, the closest temples were Chicago, Denver, Dallas, and St. Louis, and they're all about 300 miles from Lawrence. So Krishna placed that there for me. I read it, and then the next 6 months or so, I read the entire Bhagavad Gita and was just completely blown away. Which then raised me to the next problem, which was another couple months went by, and I found myself in my senior year. And I was already on to reading the Srimad Bhagavatam, and I was just miserable because I knew I was in the wrong place, and I had no idea, and I wasn't, secure enough and brave enough or whatever to just drop out and go visit a temple. So I was really earnestly praying to Krishna somehow or another, I want to be a devotee. I knew if I did not do something drastic, I'd probably miss out. I knew that Prabhupada wasn't going to live forever, and I really wanted to be his disciple. And so I was just really in this sort of very frustrated state of mind. And then the next thing you know, I get a knock on my doorbell, and it was Budara, who was the lead on the Dristadumya and Sudama's bus party. And they were coming down from Chicago, the big reunion in Chicago that many have talked about. And they were going to turn, west from St. Louis. They met the devotees in St. Louis. I had visited them the year before. Mukunlal and Pranandas were there. Somehow they kept my address and my telephone number. And they told them, go look up this guy at the University of Kansas. They knocked on the door, and my prayers are answered. Budara was basically the first one bringing a whole busload of about 15 other devotees to the University of Kansas. And even at the time, I wasn't really sure what I was doing. All I knew is I wanted to help them. So I kind of cut classes, set up lectures at the university, even did a television show with Dristadumya Swami. It wasn't a Swami at the time, but Dristadumya with Professor Alfonso Verdu, who I still remember, on Asian studies. And by the end of the week, I had done so many things with the Radha Damodara party and just felt so obliged to help and give them whatever they needed that as Friday afternoon came, they were going to spend a week and then they were going to move on. And they made it clear they were going to leave. And they looked at me and they said, what are you going to do? And I actually talked about a little bit about this on my other presentation, but it really got down to, you give us everything you own, but you haven't given us you. And that's kind of what it got down to. And I couldn't say no. I just couldn't say no. So they said, I had long hair. They cut my hair. They put me on the bus. We spent another 3 or 4 days packing everything I owned, shipping it back to whoever I thought might best benefit from it. Completely freaked my parents out because they had no idea that I just dropped out of college. And what made it even worse was that I actually wrote them a letter, being the responsible guy that I like to think of myself as being. But I was in such a state of mental turmoil, I didn't address it to my parents' house in New York. I addressed it where, in other words, what I did is I put the address that should have gone on to my parents. I put that in the return address, and I put the address for the Radha Damodara head office, which at the time was in Florida, to the addressee. So it went to Keshava Bharti and Rajendranath down in Florida, And they're wondering, why do we get this weird letter from this guy that just joined Radha Damodar at the University of Kansas? And they just let it sit there. And so I joined Radha Damodar. Somebody said last week when I was listening that not many people directly joined Radha Damodar. I was one of those rare people. And so I wrote that letter, but and I did that on October, I believe it was October 10th, 1975, I think it was. I assumed my parents got the letter. Of course, they didn't. And it wasn't until about 3 or 4 months later when I finally got to LA, I got on the bus, shaved my head, joined the whole party, agreed, took on the task of doing Sankirtan, not because I particularly wanted to, but I just felt a real obligation. Somebody had said something about it I think it was Brigapati was saying how it was kind of a military environment. I've always referred to as Radha Damodar as the ISKCON Marine Corps. It's just was very, very, every minute you were on, you were doing it, you were going forward. And so anyhow, I finally called my parents when I got back to New York, which was literally 3 or 4 months later, finally feeling comfortable enough to be able to talk to them. And my mother practically, she had a heart attack because she finally talked to me after 3 months and was happy to know that I was still alive. And there's all sorts of very interesting stories that are in there too. So anyhow, when I joined Radha Damodar, Trista Dumi was there with Sudama Swami, and I kind of made it very, I was going to do it anyway. I figured I might as well bargain for what I could. And I said, if I'm going to join Radha Damodar, fine, I'll do that. I'm going to drop out of college, but I want to go to India. And I want it understood now that I'm going to go to India. So they all agreed to it. But Tamal Krishna Maharaj, I got along actually pretty good with him. But he could see pretty quickly that I knew how to get things done. And I really leveraged that big time. So when we eventually ended up back at the New York temple just before we went to the 1976 big initiation, where I got my first initiation in Vrindavan, in the Vrindavan courtyard, I had made it clear that I wanted to stay in India, but they pulled me back and they took me back to the United States again. And Trados came down, and it was basically, what was I going to do with the New York temple? We had just purchased the 55th Street New York temple. And for those of us who are familiar with that building, it was a huge building and it had a million things that needed to be done to it. And I felt I could be much more valuable doing things there than going out doing Sankirtan, which I didn't really have much of an affinity for. I was okay at it, but I just didn't feel like it was the right place for me to be. And Tamal picked up on it. So when Trados came down and said, okay, you're going to go on this party or that party, I said, yeah, I don't think so. And I leveraged it with Tamal Krishna Maharaj, who was very, very, who immediately started engaging me. And one of the things he engaged me in was to actually build the New York Radha Govinda deities. We actually made a sort of a false facade, or I should say a duplicate facade of the Govindaji temple in Vrindavan, which was a whole interesting thing in itself, because we had all sorts of very interesting, talented artists doing all this sculpture work, but nobody knew how anything was going to fit together. So Tamal Krishna Maharaj asked me to work on that. And that's when I really started bonding with him. And we finally did get it's really sad. There's a whole long, sad story about what happened in New York. I mean, there was a lot of wonderful things too, but it's just too bad what happened. But in any case, we built a whole facade, and just prior to Prabhupada coming for the big, huge 1976 Rath Yatra Festival, which he had envisioned 10 years early in 1965 or 66, there's stories about how he envisioned having a parade down Fifth Avenue. Of course, he didn't have any disciples. He didn't really have much of anything at the time. But then literally 10 years later, we did it. And it was an extraordinary event. But I was pulled off the construction of the temple facade in the temple room 3 days prior to the parade to go down and help, because Jayananda was working very quickly and he was doing a great job. They had started that project. They had started building the Roth carts in January that year in the old New York bindery, which was part of the whole Henry Street complex, I guess, at the time, or it was somehow tied together. And Jayananda was a little nervous that he wasn't going to get it done. And there's a whole big thing that happened the night before the parade, Saturday night before the parade. I went down, I was bonding very nicely with Jayananda also. He was happy to see us come down and help him out. And then right as the Roth cart was going up, for the first time, Balaram's Roth cart was going up with the idea that it was going to go out on parade route the next morning, you know, at 9 o'clock in the morning when the parade started. And as we were putting the Roth cart top up, a big gust of wind came down the Hudson River, right over the top of the train station, and just threw the whole thing on the ground and smashed it to pieces. And it was a huge emotional moment for all of us. And I actually have a whole separate talk. I'm not going to go into it here. If people want to hear what happened, I've got a story. It's on my website, jagannath.com, the story and me narrating that. But essentially what happened is after a lot of discussion, a lot of emotion, and a lot of hair pulling, I just got on top of the Roth cart. Jayananda said he'd be happy to let me try doing it, but I had on two conditions. One was I couldn't bother him, and I couldn't take any of his people. So the thing is I had to corral people. Fortunately, people were coming from all over the East Coast to the parade. And so I got a couple of people to stay up, and we ended up staying up to about 2 o'clock in the morning and gluing and taping and rebuilding stuff. And somehow or another, we actually got that cart back into the parade very early at that day. So these kind of things really got Tamal to not want to let me go anywhere, even though he knew he owed me service in India. And so the next thing he asked me to do was send me to Harrisburg. And Kunta Dave's there. He knows, he was the milk truck driver back and forth to Harrisburg. Harrisburg was Harrisburg was sort of a satellite from the Gita Nagari temple. He would drive to the Gita Nagari temple to get the produce and the milk. Gita Nagari was a very promising alternative to, or I should say, a competitive of New Vrindavan. And in fact, it was even more so than I think people realize, because at one point, Tamal Krishna Maharaj specifically asked me to go with him in a van to drive all the way from New York to New Vrindavan. And while we were on the trip, he was specifically coaching me and saying, I want you to be my guy, and I want New Vrindavan. I want to make Gita Nagari even better and more wonderful and more talked about than New Vrindavan. And I think a lot of people are aware of the fact that New Vrindavan had this sort of rocky history of things going on there that, no, we don't need to go into details now. But he specifically wanted to set up Gita Nagari to be sort of like the ideal Vedic perfect village, like Sturbridge Village, which is a sample in New York of an old Plymouth, an old settlers or pilgrim town, I believe it is. So anyhow, so we went on that trip. It was kind of cute. I was such a young devotee and didn't know anything about Krishna consciousness that he, of course, Tamal had all this wonderful milk sweets and things that he got from the pujaris for the trip. And so while we were going, he was giving me a piece of burfi. And as I think many know, the burfi had this very nice paper, you know, very flaky aluminum film, not aluminum, silver film on top of the burfi. So he handed me the burfi, and so I start trying to pull the silver off, like I'm thinking it's aluminum foil or something. And he's looking at me like I'm an idiot. And he says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I don't want to eat the aluminum foil." He says, "That's not aluminum foil, that's silver. You want to eat that too, you know?" So I had a lot of nice exchanges like that. At one point, Tamal Krishna Maharaj had specifically asked me to, or I should say, actually, Tamal Krishna Maharaj inquired from Dristadumya. I did a lot of work with Dristadumya. Dristadumya, I think a lot of people would say, was kind of like almost Tamal's shadow in those days. And so I had a lot of connection through Dristadumya to Tamal Krishna Maharaj. And I think at one point, Tamal Krishna Maharaj is asking Dristadumya, Tamal Krishna Maharaj had a lot of people back then had their own like verse books and ways to quote and remember things and study books and things like this. So he had one too. And I think the 6th canto had just come out with Ajamil or something. And he wanted somebody to like print very carefully and very neatly, almost, because back then we didn't have computers and auto typers and stuff like we have now. So he wanted somebody to print very neatly into his notebook all of the verses he wanted to memorize from the 6th canto. And I guess I got selected for that because I guess I had a good handwriting. So anyhow, I had a lot of really wonderful opportunities to work with Tamal, but they eventually got down to, you know, I just had to start really making a lot of noise and saying, look, you know, I want to go to India. I want to go to India. I want to go to India. And I guess finally he realized that at some point, I think I actually wrote him a letter and kind of in my own brazen way, kind of challenged him a little bit and said, hey, you guys are supposed to be Brahmins. Your words are supposed to be, truth. And you can't, you gave me your word and you got it. Now you got to come through with the goods here. I want to go to India. So finally, he agreed and they set me up. And I was originally supposed to go to Mumbai or Bombay in those days. But Tamal Krishna Maharaj was having, Bombay was just opening. It was, I think, 1976. It was in December, I think December 1976. He was having friction with Tamal, with Sarabi Swami, and it got to the point where Tamal had to leave Bombay, and his attitude was, we're not sending Maheshwar to Bombay. No way I'm doing that. We're sending him to Mayapur. So literally, like within 2 or 3 days after I was ready to get on the plane, I was completely rerouted from Bombay to Mayapur. And so I went to Mayapur, and then my participation in Mayapur, when they found out that I had originally built the Rath carts with Jayananda and then rebuilt them again in 1977, which is a whole nother story, because back in those days, what we had to do in New York, because New York, you don't have space to just park a Roth cart on the street someplace. We literally had to take the whole thing apart, every single beam, everything. And then we pushed it all into the New York garage, and then somebody had to put it all back together the next year. So I did that. And so when I got to Calcutta, the word got out that I knew how to build Roth carts. So I built the first they had Roth carts before in Calcutta, but I did the really first big one that they had in 1978, I think it was. There was a whole story that goes beyond that. That story is on the Calcutta website if anybody wants to see it. We had some serious problems the first time around. A whole interesting story there too, because I was used to New York. We had a lot of people when Prabhupada came, but when I went to Calcutta, people were telling me, you don't realize how many people are going to show up for this. And I'm going, yeah, I know. I've done Rath Yatra before, no big deal. And they said, no, you don't realize. You're in Calcutta, you're just north of Orissa. The Bengalis that's their whole culture. There's going to be over 1 million people here. And I said, yeah, sure. I thought everybody was just trying to encourage me. And sure enough, the Roth cart made it over to the temple in the morning, fine. But by the time the parade started at whatever it was, 10, 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock, something like that, it was insane. I mean, it was just completely insane. You couldn't even get through the temple room. I mean, you literally had to kind of like go like this to get people out of the way. And of course, everybody, including the police and Jayapataka Swami and Satchidananda Swami and all the big shots were there. And everybody was looking at me, okay, how are we going to do this? And I'm going, look, I just built the cart. I don't know how to hold the whole festival. And so, and keep in mind, there's Bengali, there's Orissan, there's Hindi, there's all these different dialects going on. And we got up in front of the cart and it was kind of like, okay. And back in those days, the way Jayananda built Roth carts they used like these kind of parallel bars that were tied into the steering thing. You can see a very nice picture that Rashanta took on the Back to Godhead cover of 19, whatever it is, of the 76 parade. And you literally walk in front of the cart and you just sort of lean into these bars and it moves the steering, and that's how you steer it. But the problem was in Calcutta, the whole city of Calcutta was there. There was no room for anybody to practically stand in front of the cart. It was just the same way the temple was, like this. And, every Bengal and every young age Bengali was an expert on Rath Yatra, and they wanted to drive it. And I was just overwhelmed. I just couldn't, I didn't know what to do. And so at some point, the police were saying, when are you going to get this parade going? And Jayapataka is leaning down. He said, when are you going to get this parade going? I said, oh, well, okay, let's do it. And the cart just literally leaped forward with so much energy, and the wheels just kind of came down and crammed into, it was a very high curb on the right side. And the wheels kind of crammed into the curb, immediately came to a dead stop. And because there was so much thrust, they literally just twisted the whole axle to the point where it was like one of those old broken, shopping carts in your grocery store. And there's no way that cart was going to go another foot. And that was within the first 10 feet of the parade. So anyhow, there's a whole story about that, which was my trial by fire building Roth carts. But But I want to say one more thing here. I want to say two things here real quick, so before I use up all my time. One of them is a little bit of a sensitive issue, but I feel responsible to say this, especially because there's so many devotees, disciples of Tamal Krishna Maharaj in the Houston temple. And again, apologize for the awkwardness of this, but we all know there's been some very ugly rumors spread around, and it really, really bothered me. And I knew all the players regarding these rumors. So in 2020, I actually released the book Deception, which I'm just showing here so people can be familiar with it. I don't know if it's going to see it on the camera. Anyhow, the camera's not picking it up. But anyhow, I released the book Deception, and I released the movie Deception, which vindicated all of the accused devotees of this horrible rumor that somebody poisoned Srila Prabhupada. I don't want to elaborate on it, but I do want to let everybody know there is a tremendous, this is a 500-page book with court-worthy evidence that thoroughly proves there's no way in the world that that could have ever happened. And I wanted to get that out of the way before I say something which is really kind of my last exchange with Tamal Krishna Maharaj, which came 1995. So I had gone to India, came back to India, from India, worked with the legal department, eventually took on a householder situation, got a professional career working for the Department of Defense at the Port Hueneme Navy Surface Warfare Center as a database engineer, which is how I funded my lifestyle, and always worked very much in parallel with what ISKCON was doing, always trying to step in and encourage, was very heavily involved in rebuilding and designing all of the, what I think are probably the most sophisticated Roth carts in our movement, which are the 3 huge LA Roth carts that are made out of aluminum. And all 3 of them are actually go into one 53-foot tractor trailer truck and can be moved anywhere. And there's a whole long kind of interesting stories surrounding that. But by 1995, I think most of us know, Tamal had run into some issues because Radha Damodara, as we know, I was one of the rare few they actually pulled out of college, which was interesting too, because when they took me out of college, Tamal, just Jimmy kept on making phone calls like, yeah, we got him from college. I'm going like, I started making think, well, what's that mean? I mean, how weird is that? I felt like a pariah almost, but anyhow, a lot of the people came from the temples. Some of the other devotees were talking about that earlier. And this really did not go well with the temple presidents, who were losing manpower and created a lot of friction, which eventually led to the whole kind of slip of the tongue where Tamal said, I might as well preach in China, which is eventually what Prabhupada actually asked him to do. And so he's about 1995, he was kind of in this transition. He was sort of slapped down by the GBC. Hridayananda Swami was in Santa Barbara, which is about 45 minutes from here. And apparently Tamal Krishna Maharaj was up there, and he was just really withdrawn and kind of figuring out, what am I going to do? Trying to figure out how he was going to go to China. He actually was asking me about, because I was in the computer engineering world, he was asking me about software and ways. Back then, things like Zoom and Skype and computer technology wasn't anywhere nearly as developed as it is today. So he was asking for, suggestions of how he could maybe leverage the computer technology so he could he wanted to set up, like, what do they call it? Units, cells, individual cells in China, because of the communist country. They didn't want to have a problem with too many people gathering at once, and then the government, communist country, would come down and smash everything. So he wanted to have little cells of maybe 5 to 10 people. And then as the cells grew, then they would break into other cells, which is kind of the way you do subversive preaching in a communist country. And so I talked with him about that. And then I was doing programs here at home. And then Hridayananda called me up one day and he said, Maheshwar, you got to call Tamal Krishna Maharaj and invite him to preach at your house. And I was like, no, that doesn't work like that. He's the big Swami, and I'm just some little guy that ran around on Radha Damodara for a while and did a few things here and there. But he doesn't take orders from me. It's the other way around. And Hridayananda literally called me 3 times, and he said, Maheshwar, I'm telling you, you have to do this. You have to call Tamal. And he was explaining to me that he was really kind of like, I don't want to make it over dramatize it, but he was very frustrated because, we all know, and so many people have very correctly pointed out, that Tamal was so capable in so many ways, that, here's this really powerful guy. and he's sort of sitting there in Santa Barbara with his wings clipped, and he really doesn't know which way to go. And China hasn't really opened up yet, and he's trying to figure out what to do. And he just needed to get on the Vyasa and preach, because that's where his strength was. And so finally he convinced me, and I was kind of a little bit nervous about it. I said, okay, I'll call him up. So I called him up on the phone and kind of said, hey, Tamal Krishna Maharaj, is that you? He said, yes, Maheshwar. And I said, oh, please send my obeisances. And he said, and I said, well, I'm wondering, you know, I have my little kind of like little, what do you call it? Namhata program going on here in Ojai. You know, we get 15, 20 people, maybe on a good night, we get 25 or 30. You know, he's used to preaching to thousands, you know, and I'm thinking, why the heck would he want to come? And by the way, my backyard is where the Roth cart's sitting behind me in the photo. So that's where we had the people come and sit at the time. And, I was just it was very awkward. And so I finally kind of muttered it out. I said, well, you know, maybe would you be willing to come and kind of speak at my program? And it was just very, you know, reassuring. He said, Maeshwara, I would be honored to come speak at your program at Ojai. And I was like, wow, okay, that's good. Now we got to work out the details, you know. So sure enough, we figured all out. Okay, this time, this date, blah 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 blah. But here's what I'd kind of like to end on, and give respect for everybody else to ask questions if they like. Is when he drove up, he came down with Sri Dayananda Goswami. And when he got out of the car, of course, I was there to greet him with a garland or whatever at the time. And he walks up to me, and I go to him, Hare Krishna Maharaj. And the first thing he says to me is, Maheshwar, how can I serve you? And I was like, and I laughed, and I just sort of laughed. I said, isn't this a little awkward? I said, I'm supposed to be asking you that. And he said, no. He says, I'm asking you that. And so I showed him where he was going to speak. And he, you know, I brought him in, gave him some refreshments he got here a little early, put him on the Vyasa. And we had about 100 people here that night, because at the time, my advertising campaign, it was a whole different world in 1995. I think people realize that things have changed quite dramatically in the last 20 years. Preaching is getting more and more difficult, and Ojai has every New Age organization in the world here. And I've talked about that many times. I'm not going to get into it now, but we had about 100 people here, and he was on fire. And I think I still have an audio tape of what he said that night. And you could just see people were like, whoa, they were just like, who is this guy? You know, I've never heard anything like this before in my life. And so finally he left. We had a big feast. And I have to tell you that I had people in my living room till 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun was coming up, who were still wanting to know more about Krishna consciousness and what happened and where can they see him again? Where will they be able to hear from him again? This kind of stuff. So, you know, it's very sad, unfortunately, that there are some people, I like to say that Krishna is so extraordinary. We say Krishna is all attractive. He attracts everybody. Unfortunately, he also attracts some very strange and maybe disturbed people. And they also come to Krishna consciousness, and they cannot help but be who they are. And so this, I believe, and I think to a certain extent, maybe in some very strange way, Krishna's arranged this to distract them so they can all kind of get dragged off into these other, what I call the ISKCON basher groups, and do their thing over there, because they're really not helping anything Lord Chaitanya wants to have go down. But the fact of the matter is that, yeah, Tamal could be a little bit of a controversial person from here to there. And yeah, he did sometimes do things that were very controversial and probably upset a few people. But I think it's pretty well agreed upon by the people like myself who had an opportunity to really kind of walk side by side with him through his journey until he passed away in 2003 or whatever it was. That he went through his own transitions, and he also really, he always had a very sweet side, but I think he really became even more and more sensitive and aware and appreciative and complimentary and cooperative as he matured, just like all the rest of us do. So that's kind of what I'd like to leave this with. I don't think I have any other things I'd like to bring up, but I might think of some more along the way here. They're just little vignettes, like when I was driving the Radha Damodara van from LA back to New York, we went through Texas. This is my big thrilling story. And we were taught on Radha Damodara to never say, take no for an answer. Somebody said they don't have any money. You say, no, look in your glove compartment. I bet you have some there. Well, because we were doing parking lots, Kmart parking lots. And they'd say, well, you know, I just don't have any money. I said, well, look in your glove, look in your ashtray, look in your pockets. Tell you what, we'll take whatever change you got. And I actually, at one point, we were giving away the big, huge, brand new printed Krishna books that had just come off the press for pocket change, because we paid, because when I joined, I gave a lot of money, so all the books are paid for. So we were told, just get whatever you can and push the books out. But we were told never to take no for an answer. So I was in Texas in some parking lot and doing my very awkward and unpolished presentation for selling books, and walked up to some big Texas guys sitting in a huge truck. They had a shotgun in the window of the back of the truck. And I went walking up and knocked on the door, and the guy kind of turns around and he says, what do you want? And I said, I'm just doing incense, you know, sticking an incense in. I'm just doing incense and trying to, and the guy looks at me and says, we don't want your damn incense and we don't want your damn books. And I said, well, you know, I know it's probably a little unusual, because by the way, also, I think people realize that back in the days when Spiritual Sky produced incense, incense was not really well known in the United States. It was really just starting to become something that people were beginning exposed to. Now, every New Age movement, everybody in the New Age knows all about it. But back then, Spiritual Sky really kind of broke the doors down for incense in the United States. So it was weird, and you had to explain it to people. And Brigapati was saying it's some kind of an insect chaser or something like that. You know, we had all sorts of things to explain it. But these guys were big 20-gallon caps, and they're sitting there drinking their beer, and I'm being, hi Krishna, hi, you want some incense, you want a book? And the guy, and don't take no for an answer, right? And so the guy's looking at me and he's saying, I told you, kid, I don't want your books, and we don't want you here. You get what I say? And I'm going, well, I know it's very strange and awkward, and you know, I haven't met you before, and you know, I did whatever silly routine I could do at the time, and was pulling stuff out of my book bag. And the next time I looked up, the guy had a revolver facing me right like 3 inches away from my nose. And he said, I told you I don't want to hear from you anymore. You understand what I'm saying? And I kind of went, ooh, yeah, I think I do very much. Have a nice day. And I just turned around and walked away. So that's my big thrilling story on Radha Damodara Sankirtan. And I'll end there. And thank you all for being so patient and listening. And this is a great reunion.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. That was really great. And Brigapati Prabhu, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. Well, first I'd like to thank Marshwa. He's an amazing speaker, and I know that if he was able to, he could probably continue on for hours, and it would be just as interesting as the last half hour was. He's got so many interesting stories. But I just wanted to say thank you to Vaikanas Maharaj, who I haven't seen except for maybe 2 seconds 25 years ago in 48 years, because I knew him as Janardhan Prabhu, and he was my first, more or less, Bhakta leader when I first joined. He was in charge of the Harinam party that went out every day on the Henry Street Temple in Brooklyn, and he really helped me a lot when I was a brand new person in the temple. I was extremely spaced out and, you know, weird, and I'm still weird, but thanks to him, I'm a lot less spaced out. He really lovingly pushed me, you know, to get over a lot of different obstacles, and he just really helped me a lot. So I'm seeing him here now. I didn't recognize him at first because it was a different name, and when he started speaking with Kalki, I realized, oh, there he is, you know. So anyway, thank you, Prabhu. I really appreciate your help there, and thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
I remember one of these parties we went out, we were in Central Park, and we had a chanting line, and you were in it, and some